Welcome, Night Wanderer. The fires are lit, the tale waits. Please like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who dreams in history. It means the world and helps our sleepy little corner grow. Now, lie back, let the quiet begin. In tonight's chapter, we sail with Celtic raiders and rest among their chants. This is episode 7. In this lecture, we're going to discuss the society of the Celtic lands in the early Middle Ages. How was it organized? What were some of its distinctive institutions? What was the role of the family in this society? We'll talk quite a bit in this lecture about the role of law and lawyers in Celtic society for two closely related reasons. First, law was clearly very important to these societies. And second, we know this because we have so many surviving legal texts. So while many people associate the Celts with literature and art, and rightly so, we should keep in mind that the law was just as important. Finally, we'll talk a bit about the role of women in Celtic societies, since this is a topic that has received quite a bit of attention from scholars and from the general public in recent years. Were women better off in Celtic societies than in some other cultures? We'll see that the evidence is not clear-cut, but it certainly is intriguing. Most of the evidence I will talk about in this lecture comes from Ireland, but some is from Wales. Let's start by making a general statement that applies to both Wales and Ireland. In both places, as early as we can see it in any detail, we have a notable unity in culture, but a fragmentation in politics. This is far different from what we find in, say, early Anglo-Saxon England. As a result, it is far easier to say something about what society was like in early Ireland and Wales than it is to say who exactly was running it. So most of what I have to say will be about the structure of society, not about individual rulers. In order to help us organize our thoughts about this society, I am going to use a basic description of early Ireland that every scholar of Ireland knows by heart, though it applies in most senses to Wales as well. The great historian Daniel Binchy claimed in 1954 that early Ireland was tribal, rural, hierarchical, and familiar. And this statement has been refined and criticized since, but I think it's essentially true, and it's a useful way of organizing the information. So I'm going to follow this fourfold schema, but I'm actually going to use a different order than Binchy does. So apologies to Daniel Binchy. Let's start with the first term in Binchy's definition, tribal. Binchy was not using the word in any sort of technical anthropological sense. What he means here is that Ireland was composed of many small units or kingdoms, possibly at least 100 at any one time. These kings, or riche, ruled over tuatha, which means not kingdoms, but rather peoples. If you remember from my lecture on Irish literature, the supernatural characters who figure in the mythological cycle are known as the Tuatha De Danann, the peoples of the goddess Danu. So these kingdoms consisted of small kin groups, all owing allegiance to the ruler. As we saw in previous lectures, the succession was often hotly disputed among the relatives of the previous ruler, so the politics of these small units was frequently very convoluted. This is why it was a good idea to have an origin story in which the future king kissed the goddess of sovereignty. This papered over some rather brutal faction fights, which often occurred within the royal family. Besides these tiny kingdoms, Ireland was also very loosely divided into bigger units called provinces, and these are referred to in the early sources. But they don't have fixed borders, and they're not concrete political entities. They're more like geographical ideas. There were at various points 4 or 5 of these provinces. In the early period, the word for province is coiceth, which means a fifth, and this is still the word for province in Irish today, but nowadays there are only 4 left. Ulster is in the north, Connacht in the west, Leinster in the southeast, and Munster in the southwest. The middle province was called Meath, which just means middle, but it has been absorbed by the other 4. Today there's a county Meath, but not a province. There were no political entities, thus, that covered the whole country. Your political loyalty would have probably been very localized indeed. It would be determined by your relationship to the king or ri of your own tuath, and that might be a group of only a few thousand people. With such a fragmented society, it won't surprise you to learn that there were no real cities in early Ireland. This is the second part of Binchy's definition, that Ireland is rural. This was not as true for some of the other Celtic-speaking areas as it was for Ireland. In Ireland, people lived in widely scattered settlements, either in homesteads where there was an enclosure, that was if they were somewhat wealthy, or simply in isolated farms. We know a lot more about these enclosures. In Ireland, they're usually called ring forts, but they weren't really forts, since they were not usually placed on the highest ground available to be defensible. The most common type of ring fort was called the Roths. It was surrounded by a bank and an impressive outer ditch. Occasionally there were 2 or more walls, usually made of earth. The enclosures were not huge. About 100 feet in diameter was typical. Another type of ring fort was built with stone. This is the cashel, and you see these mostly in the west where the landscape is rockier, and you do tend to find these on higher ground. We're not sure exactly why. They're built with dry stone walls, usually without ditches. A final kind of enclosure I want to mention is the dune, which is a more elaborate stone structure, often with separate concentric stone rings. And these may have been intended for defense. For example, Dún Aengus on Inishmore in the Aran Islands is on the edge of a high cliff, so a seaborne invasion would have been extremely difficult. And outside of its concentric walls, it has a very elaborate system of stone slabs that would have constituted a formidable barrier to anyone attacking from the land. But some scholars have suggested that a site like Dún Aengus could have been used for ritual purposes, like a sort of amphitheater. The fact is that we don't have enough evidence to decide, and perhaps the site was used for both defense and ritual. But sites like Dún Aengus are comparatively rare. They would have taken a lot of resources, and very few people in early Ireland commanded that much labor. Houses, whether inside or outside of enclosures, were usually round and made of wood and wicker, and you can actually visit a reconstruction of these houses at the Irish National Heritage Park in County Wexford, where you can stay overnight in a ring fort. There's one last kind of dwelling I want to mention. It's called a crannog, and it was, by definition, found on an island in a lake. This is a very old tradition in Ireland that goes back to the late Bronze Age and continued well into the Christian period, and you can visit a modern reconstruction of a crannog in County Clare. A crannog's island might be natural, or it might be artificial. Now, it was a very labor-intensive process to create an artificial island, so crannogs must have been at least partly intended for defense. It would have a causeway connecting it to the mainland that could be removed if necessary to defend against attack. But this could also have been a way to assert status. You have the resources to build a crannog. So who lived in these dwellings, whether they were crannogs or ring forts or simpler houses? Largely we're talking about family groups. So here is where we get to the third term in Binchy's definition, familiar, as in family-centered. And it's clear that the family, not the individual, was the basic unit of Irish society. There was a precise definition of the family for legal purposes. It was called the finne, or kin group, and it extended to more or fewer members depending on the particular situation involved. And this is not so different from today. We probably all have different family groups that we include for different purposes. Who do you invite for Thanksgiving dinner? Who do you invite to your cousin's wedding? Who just gets an announcement in the mail? That sort of thing. But for the Irish, these things were not mere social issues. They were matters of law and property. What did it mean to belong to the finne? Well, it gave you rights. You had the right to inherit land within this group. But it also brought responsibilities. The kin group had to consult each other about the distribution or sale of property, and also stand with each other in the face of legal disputes. I'll talk about both land and the law in turn. Let's start with land. The finne was often given the specific name der finne, which literally meant certain kin, and this meant all the relatives who went back to a common great-grandfather. So that's 4 generations. This was the usual group that would be involved in inheriting land and property. So what you possessed was almost entirely determined by your family ties. It was a male-centered group, because a married woman belonged to the der finne of her husband. All the men in this group had some potential share in the land of the kindred, and it was this group that could normally compete for the rulership of the tuath. Inheritance was not determined by the marital status of the parents. There was no hard and fast line between legitimate and illegitimate offspring, as long as the father acknowledged paternity. And the family had to approve all major property transfers. To a certain extent, everything was family property, and you had to get the consent of the group to allow a sale to go through. So there were serious pressures to come to satisfactory arrangements. This was one aspect of Irish property law that the later English colonizers of Ireland really had a hard time with, because, understandably, it seriously complicated questions of ownership and clear title. What about the family and the law? The Irish legal system, about which I'll talk more in a moment, was entirely based on what we would think of as civil law rather than criminal law. And that's perhaps not surprising in a highly fragmented society with very rudimentary government institutions. In other words, it was all about the lawsuit. People sued each other for things that would be considered criminal offenses today, like murder and assault. These matters were handled as private transactions between the parties. But it was the 2 kin groups who settled the dispute, not the 2 individuals, because the losing party in the suit got to hit up his relatives to help him pay the damages he owed to the winner. Your contribution was prorated based on the closeness of your relationship to the offender. Now this system was a real incentive to keep your difficult cousin Yochi in line. If he caused trouble, you were going to have to pay for it. On the upside, if someone killed one of your relatives, well, it was payday. Okay? You got a full share of the compensation for the death of a parent, a half for a paternal uncle or maternal aunt, and a third for a cousin. Now, you wouldn't be rewarded directly for getting rid of your cousin Yochi, because there was no compensation for murders within the finne. No one knows how these issues played out in practice. Probably some relatives had more influence within the kin group than others. But the basic principle is that the family is in it together. But a family could also be artificially extended by the institution of fosterage, in which children were raised by another family, sometimes from quite early ages. And this often resulted in lifelong ties of friendship that could be very useful in economic and political relationships later in life. Fosterage was pervasive in all the Celtic-speaking lands. It could be done inside or outside of the kin group, and we often see friendships between foster family members very movingly depicted in literature, particularly when the obligations of fosterage come into conflict with some other important obligation. For example, as I mentioned in my lecture on Irish literature, in the Toyne, the great Ulster hero Cuchulainn is forced by reasons of honor to fight against his foster brother Ferdia. The combat goes on for 3 days, and the 2 warriors speak in very moving verse about their love for each other, and how loath they are to harm each other. But Cuchulainn inevitably does kill Ferdia, in his great sorrow. And the plot of the great tale from the King cycle, the destruction of Doderga's hostel, turns on King Conor's reluctant decision to give special preference to his criminal foster brothers. and this failure to put strong personal ties aside for the good of his kingdom causes Conor's destruction. Fosterage could be between families of equal status, but it could also take place between families of unequal status. It was a sign of favor for a lord to ask his follower to foster his child. And it was also a huge benefit to a lower status person to be raised in a wealthier household. And that brings me to the final characteristic of Irish society, the fact that it was hierarchical. Families varied greatly in status, as they did in many medieval societies, and much of your daily existence was determined by where you stood in this hierarchy. This status was fixed according to two main criteria: wealth and occupation, and this had serious financial implications. I just said that kin groups had to help pay compensation for the injuries inflicted by their members. What determined the total price? It was the social status of the victim. The more important they were, the more you had to pay for injuring them. The price was expressed in a unit called the covel, which was worth either one slave girl or 3 cows. Right here you can see that slavery was a major part of this society, if slave girls are considered a monetary unit. We'll come back to this when we talk about the status of women. The price was meant to compensate for the loss of the victim's honor, or eneth, literally face, so loss of face, which is an expression we commonly use today. You could lose face not just by being physically injured, but also by being merely insulted, and the Irish apparently spent an awful lot of time dissing each other and then suing over it. Of course, the lawsuits were meant as a substitute for the other main recourse we know of when people diss each other, namely violence. And it's plain that there was a lot of that as well. It was a society that was very touchy on the subject of honor, and certainly people still feel this way. In 1987, Ronald Reagan's Irish-American Secretary of Labor, Raymond Donovan, was accused of corruption, but ultimately cleared. When he walked out of court, he asked reporters, "Which office do I go to get my reputation back?" His Irish ancestors would have had an answer for him, and they would have known exactly how much his reputation cost. So what were the major divisions that determined how much it would cost to insult you in ancient Ireland? Well, kings were in a class of their own, virtually. But once Christianity took root, they were not quite alone at the top. Bishops were given the same status as kings, and the highest poets belonged in that category too. Underneath kings and bishops, society was divided into 3 main groups: nobles, the learned classes, and farmers. Slaves were at the bottom, of course, and they had no honor price per se. Compensation for slaves was treated as a simple property matter. I'll start with the nobles. They varied in importance based on how wealthy they were, meaning how many cows they had, since that was the real touchstone of wealth in this period, as you can see in the Toyn. But also, it was reckoned by how many clients they had. Now, what in this context is a client? The word in Irish is Céile, or Kelly. So the many people with the surname Kelly are named for people in this very important relationship of subordination in early Ireland. But before the Kellys get too insulted, let me say that there could be very rich and important people, even nobles themselves, who were also clients. So what's clientship? First of all, it's a relationship that distinguishes nobles from commoners. Nobles can be clients without losing their noble status. I'll explain that in a minute. But you can't be a noble without having clients yourself. In other words, you must have people depending on you if you want to be able to call yourself a noble. It was a relationship that could benefit both sides. Clients received from the noble usually a piece of land, some cattle to start with, legal help if necessary, and, very important, protection from violence. In return, the noble was entitled to various things from the client, based on the status of the client. Labor service, cattle, dairy products, grain, malt, meat. So the noble got someone to work his land and give him part of the proceeds. There were two main kinds of clientship: free clientship and base clientship. Base here means low or servile status, like in base-born. Free clients would usually get a larger piece of land, perhaps an entire enclosure with accompanying farmland. It was a transaction that did not imply social subordination, and it could be ended at the mutual convenience of the parties. The price for that freedom, though, was that rents were higher than for base clients. But often the people who entered into this were people who could afford it. The duties demanded of free clients were fairly light. They had to show respect to the Lord by attending him and rising when he entered the room. So essentially you had to be part of an entourage when the Lord needed to impress people. And you did have to provide some labor services, but it was understood that usually you would have your people, your own dependents, take care of this for you. One of the chief purposes of free clientship was to create and extend the social network beyond the kin group, just as fosterage did. Of course, the free clients also formed part of the Lord's war band. Base clientship was a much more lopsided arrangement, and it created ties of economic dependency between the client and the noble. The noble would give the base client cattle and tools to sort of set him up on his own, and by doing so, the noble was essentially purchasing the honor price of the client. The client was now legally dependent on his lord, and he had to pay to get out of the agreement if he wanted to end it early. In exchange, the lord got a steady food supply and free labor. The client paid a rent in food and other farm products. The labor services demanded of base clients were more onerous and, one might imagine, a bit more humiliating. Besides typical farm labor, they included digging the grave mound of the Lord and attending a commemorative funeral feast in his honor, which, depending on how popular the Lord had been, might have been quite a party. Base clients also had sub-military obligations, including patrolling the borders of their lord's land and going on an expedition called a garmsloe, or hosting. This was a very important Irish phenomenon, so I'll just define it quickly in passing. Since Ireland was so decentralized and the borders were so fluid, people would gather their armed men and make an expedition into the territory of a subordinate ruler or even of an enemy, basically to show the flag, to show that they could. Sometimes there would be fighting, sometimes not, but if you were a client, you had to go along. So what was in it for the base clients? In a very dangerous society, it helped a lot to be able to rely on a strong man for protection, and they did pay lower rents than the free clients. It seems to have worked fairly well for both sides because the institution persisted for centuries in virtually the same form. Now, what did nobles do when they weren't policing their clients? They hunted a lot, and afterwards they feasted quite a bit, and you can see this all over the tales. One of the best and funniest Irish tales is the story of a feast put on by a mischievous man named Brickrew, who deliberately stirs up rivalry between the heroes of Ulster over who should be awarded the champion's portion, the best cuts of meat and best drink, at the feast he puts on in Ulster. It helps to know that the name Brickrew means poison tongue. The story is a masterful satire of how status-conscious the Irish were, and it ends up with the women of Ulster joining in this competition for status in a hilariously undignified manner, and everyone is brawling, a real Donnybrook to be somewhat anachronistic. So that's a little bit about what we think early Irish society was like. It's stratified, it's rural, and it's very much organized around the family. But there are also these other institutions like fosterage and clientship that are designed to give people ties outside their families. These are the ties that bind in early Irish society. But have left aside one important social group besides the nobles and farmers, the learned classes. These men were called the Fili. There were two major kinds of fili, the poets and the lawyers. They had probably originally included the Druids, but of course, after the conversion to Christianity, the Druids dropped out of the equation. I have already discussed the poets in my lecture on Irish literature, so here I'll concentrate on the lawyers. Law in Ireland is very remarkable, and it forms its own subspecialty in early Irish history. We have lots of legal texts, and they seem to have been important enough to be recopied over and over in the same form. These texts seem to show an Ireland in which the legal system is uniform throughout the country. We don't know how early this became true, but one of the major signs of this is the fact that, unlike rank-and-file members of society, lawyers had free passage throughout the country. Like poets, they didn't need the permission of a king to enter his territory. Another sign of how important lawyers were is that after the conversion to Christianity, they survive as a distinct lay professional group. In most other parts of Europe, lawyers usually merged into the clergy, but in Ireland, law was a family tradition. Irish law was referred to by the English as Brehon law, from the Irish word britev, which means judge or jurist. Brehon law was one of the distinctively Irish institutions that the English later tried hard to eradicate. Irish law looks different from, say, English common law because it is mostly lists of legal rules, not records of case law. So we know a lot about what the lawyers thought should happen, but not a lot about what did happen, with only a few exceptions. To see law in action, we usually have to look at what happens in stories. And law comes up enough in the stories to reinforce the importance of law to this society. Unlike the Anglo-Saxon kings, Irish kings were not lawgivers, at least in the early period, though that changed a little bit with the arrival of Christianity. On the other hand, the concept of the king's justice was crucial. If the king was just, the land would produce abundant crops. But if the king was seen to be unjust, the land would wither. So kings were supposed to act justly, but for this, they usually enlisted the aid of judges, and there's a wonderful text that illustrates this. It is called The Judgments of Carachnid, and it purports to record an exchange between King Conn Cait Cafa, Conn of the 100 Battles, and his chief judge Carachnid, in which the king goes through a list of all the times he thinks the judge issued a faulty ruling. And then Carachnid explains, in no uncertain terms, why he was actually right all along. So you can bet a lawyer wrote this. I want to mention one additional distinctively Irish institution that caused a culture clash with the later English conquerors, namely distraint. Distraint was a recognized legal method of coercing someone into complying with the law. We think of the term distraint of trade. Here it means depriving someone of the ability to make use of their assets, usually cattle. So if someone owed you compensation and refused to pay, you could basically go and take the equivalent payment in actual cattle. Some of the cattle raiding endemic in Ireland was probably part of distraint. Not all, but certainly some. And it makes sense in a society with very little infrastructure that you would sometimes need to take the law into your own hands, and in fact that was very much the way the legal system conceived of itself. This kind of self-help was another factor that made Irish society seem rather chaotic to outsiders such as the English. Another way one could obtain redress was to shame the offender into compliance by publicly fasting on his doorstep. This made a very public show out of refusing this person's hospitality, which was a rebuke to his honor. Now, at the time of the Irish War of Independence against the British, in the 1910s and early 1920s, Irish nationalists very consciously revived this tradition with the hunger strike, as did the Irish Republican Army in Northern Ireland in the 1980s. The big difference being that we have no evidence in the early Irish texts that anyone ever actually fasted to death. There is one final topic I want to address in this lecture, and that is the status of women in Irish society. This is a huge topic and it's very controversial among scholars. Some want to see the Celtic lands as a kind of paradise where women had greater rights than in other ancient societies. Scholars who want to argue this point to a couple of kinds of evidence. For instance, they note that women could initiate divorce themselves, which was not true in some other cultures. In both Wales and Ireland, temporary unions existed and could be dissolved without permanently damaging the reputation of the female partner. And we do see occasional references to women practitioners of the learned classes, women poets, women doctors, even a female satirist as we've seen. It is also true that despite the fact that the normal rules of Irish property precluded the ownership of family property by women, there were clearly many instances in which women did own property. And this brings me to one of the figures most often cited when discussing the status of women in Ireland, namely Queen Maeve of Connacht, the great antagonist of the Ulstermen in the Táin. The great cattle raid in that story is touched off when Maeve becomes jealous of a great bull owned by her husband Ailill, and she wants to steal another bull to demonstrate her superiority. Maeve is Queen of Connacht in her own right, by inheritance from her father, the High King of Ireland, and she is anything but shy about her status and her femininity. She casts doubt on Ailill's masculine prowess, and she offers her sexual favors to pretty much anyone who will help her get what she wants. Some scholars who have looked at Maeve have assumed that any society that created a character like her must have regarded women as powerful, perhaps even as the equals of men. Now, women were very powerful in Irish folklore, and they were intimately associated with death. The battle goddess, the Morrigan, often signaled the death of a hero. The appearance of any banshee or fairy woman could be the sign of impending death or misfortune, and women had the special responsibility of keening for the dead, that is, wailing in mournful tones. The word keening comes from the Irish word for crying. But there is a lot of evidence for the subordinate status of women as well. We have lots of evidence for polygamy, at least among high-status individuals, and plenty of evidence for the sexual exploitation of women. The slave girls who notionally served as a unit of value were clearly available to their masters for that purpose, and St. Patrick even refers obliquely to the mortification that female converts felt when they were forced to engage in such acts with their masters. It is true that women could sometimes dissolve unhappy unions, but they would then return to the legal guardianship of their male relatives. What we probably see then is not a utopia for women, but a complicated picture in which some women manage to carve out niches for themselves within an otherwise male-dominated society. And that society was extremely complex, with a sophisticated legal system that regulated or attempted to regulate most aspects of social and economic life. It was culturally unified and resilient, even in the face of considerable political instability. But it was that instability that most struck the English, who observed these societies as conquerors, and that led those conquerors to determine that only the complete Anglicization of the Celtic countries could integrate them fully into civilized society. I want to talk about the complicated but fascinating interactions between the Celtic-speaking peoples and their neighbors all around the Irish Sea. We're talking here primarily about relations between the Celtic world and the Norse world, that is to say, the Vikings. So in this lecture, we'll be concentrating on the many ways in which these two worlds, each of which is extremely culturally rich in its own right, interacted with each other, both peacefully and not so peacefully. We'll be covering a relatively long time span here, ranging from the 8th century down to comparatively modern times, but I think it's worth it to follow the whole story. We'll see that the impact of the Vikings on the various Celtic-speaking areas differed considerably. Some areas were substantially transformed by their encounter with the Vikings. Other areas were barely affected at all. We'll be concentrating on the two areas where the Vikings had the most lasting effects: Ireland and Scotland. Now, the Vikings also had a substantial impact on Brittany, but Brittany was part of a different set of trading contacts and cultural ties. so I'll keep the focus on the Irish Sea. Since we already know quite a bit about the Celtic peoples by now, I want to say a few words about the Vikings, who of course deserve plenty of attention in their own right. The name Viking is not technically an ethnic name at all. It's more of a description of an occupation. To go a Viking meant to go out raiding. Most of the people who we call Vikings would have just called themselves Norsemen or Danes or something like that. But the name Viking has now become traditional, and I don't think it's worth fighting the trend. So the Vikings appeared on the scene in the late 8th century when small groups of raiders began attacking coastal settlements in the northern parts of the islands of Britain and Ireland. The most famous such raid took place in 793 in Lindisfarne off the east coast of the Anglian kingdom of Northumbria. We know a lot about this raid because news of the raid made it to the court of the German king and future emperor Charlemagne, and one of Charlemagne's close advisors was an Englishman named Alcuin, who wrote a powerful lament for the monks who had been killed or wounded in the raid. It turned out that of all the parts of Britain and Ireland that suffered from Viking raids, the English-speaking areas were hit the worst. Ultimately, all of the major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were knocked off by the Vikings except for one, the Kingdom of Wessex in the southwest. So it was Wessex that benefited when the Anglo-Saxons were ultimately able to drive the Vikings out. Wessex ended up being the only game in town, the last kingdom standing, and they were able to create a unified English kingdom by building on the wreckage left behind by the Vikings. So ironically, the Vikings helped unify the English. The impact of the Vikings was quite different in the rest of Britain and in Ireland. They had comparatively little impact in Wales. This was because Wales was a relatively poor place at the time. There were fewer monasteries than there were elsewhere in Britain, and those monasteries contained fewer treasures. Instead, the Vikings concentrated their efforts in northern Britain and in Ireland. I'll talk about Ireland first, with the understanding that in places like the northern part of the Irish Sea, the distinction between Ireland and Scotland is not very meaningful. Irish monasteries were raided repeatedly in some cases. Whether by the same band of marauders or by different ones, it is now impossible to tell. For example, around the year 800, the great monastery of Iona, which is now in Scotland but was then really part of the Irish world, was raided 3 times in a single decade. And it's a sign of how wealthy Iona was that the raiders kept finding something to steal year after year. But it was not just island monasteries or monasteries right on the coasts that were attacked. Even monastic houses that were farther inland were not immune. In 832, Vikings sacked the monastic settlement at Armagh, which is more than 20 miles from the sea. Here I need to pause for a moment to say something about a great debate among historians over how important the impact of the Vikings actually was in the history of Ireland. The Vikings in Ireland have been the subject of what historians call revisionism, which is a fancy way of saying reinterpretation. Some revisionist historians of the Vikings have argued that the impact of Viking raids on Ireland was actually minimal, particularly in comparison with their impact in England. After all, these historians point out, raids on monasteries happened a lot in Ireland anyway. It's just that the offenders were usually other Irish people. That's right, the Irish often raided monasteries as part of their own internal disputes over property and prestige. So what did it matter if the people who were attacking you were Irish or Scandinavian? The reason we think the Viking raids were so bad, these scholars argue, is that we have been listening to the voices of monastic authors who wanted to emphasize attacks by pagans over attacks by their fellow Christians. It is possible, of course, to let the revisionist pendulum swing too far. Some scholars have been so keen to exonerate the Vikings of all crimes that they have been led into some absurdities. Small Irish Christian shrines, known as house shrines, which are often richly ornamented, have been found in Scandinavia. And there's a wonderful example of such a shrine that was probably reused as a jewelry box. On the bottom, there is a runic inscription that reads, "Ranvig owns this casket." Revisionists argue that these shrines got to Scandinavia as part of a peaceful diffusion of Christianity or some sort of legitimate trading activity. Possibly, maybe a nice Viking bought it for his wife and brought it home as a souvenir. But I think we're safer in concluding that it was plundered. So give the Vikings their due, but don't turn them all into peace-loving men. They weren't. Still, if we don't take it to extremes, there is definitely something to this revisionist argument. We should keep Viking activity in perspective as just one more factor in a generally violent and unsettled scene, and in fact, we should pay just as much attention to the positive aspects of Irish-Scandinavian interaction, though in some cases, the upside of the Vikings is more apparent in retrospect than it was at the time. By the middle of the 9th century, Vikings were beginning to settle along the Irish coast, and they created the nucleus of many of the most important towns in Ireland, including Limerick, Cork, Waterford, Wexford, and, crucially, the future Irish capital, Dublin. Ireland really owes its first major effort at urbanization to Scandinavian raiders. These settlers added to the economic strength and cultural diversity of Ireland. For example, the Vikings brought a huge infusion of cash in the form of silver, much of which had been earned in trade or plunder from the Islamic world. The Irish word for market, marga, is borrowed from Old Norse, as is the word for penny, pinget. A pretty clear sign that the Irish associated the Vikings not just with violence, but with peaceful economic exchange. The Vikings also brought their sophisticated shipbuilding techniques and advanced metalworking skills to Ireland, and native craftsmen quickly adopted these techniques. Irish patrons were quite happy to purchase luxury products from Scandinavian traders. In fact, Irish art was profoundly affected by the Viking presence, to the point that by 1100 or so, the same churchmen who had earlier denounced the Vikings happily began commissioning works by Viking craftsmen, or at least by craftsmen influenced by Vikings. For example, there is the metal shrine made for the Catha, the great Psalter, the Book of Psalms of St. Columba. It was produced during the Viking period and clearly shows Viking motifs. So the Irish had no problem with using Viking art motifs to make a shrine for one of their holiest books. Around the same time, the abbots of Clonmacnoise, a great monastery in central Ireland, commissioned a crozier, a ceremonial staff, with very identifiably Scandinavian motifs on the head. The openness to outside influences that we saw in the high period of insular art continued through the Viking Age. The Vikings also profoundly changed metalwork in Ireland in another way. The dominant precious metal in Ireland had always been gold. Under the Vikings, there was a shift to silver because, as I said, the Vikings had contacts with the East where silver is plentiful. You can't get it in Ireland. Silver coins were often made into arm rings that a warrior would wear as a mark of status, and the arm rings could be reused as a form of payment themselves because they were made to a standard weight. This shift from gold to silver is very apparent if you compare the Tara brooch, which was made in the 8th century, with the later Ross Cray brooch. The later brooch has much more done in silver rather than gold. This is the effect of the Vikings on jewelry making in Ireland. Of course, one of the areas where the Vikings clearly excelled was in warfare, and the Irish were again far from opposed to borrowing from their enemies. Perhaps the most important thing they borrowed from the Vikings was the battle axe, a fearsome weapon that could be used to literally chop your enemies to bits. The Irish seem to have taken to the battle axe with great enthusiasm. So much so that by the 12th century, Gerald of Wales, who came to Ireland in the wake of the English invasion, regarded the battle axe as the Irish weapon of choice. In fact, a contemporary manuscript of his book, The History and Topography of Ireland, shows the invading English soldiers with swords and the Irish with axes. Gerald was probably totally unaware that the axes were a recent import to Ireland. Yet another example of the Irish willingness to appropriate whatever they liked about the Vikings. And it wasn't all war, of course. This assimilation was taking place in personal relationships as well. There seem to have been numerous intermarriages. For example, a mid-10th century king of Dublin and York named Olaf Sigtryggsson married two different Irish princesses, and such marriages took place at all social levels. Those probably aided in the slow Christianization of the Viking settlements. Interestingly, the Irish made a note of this development. They saw that a group of people was appearing, the children of these inter-ethnic unions, who were neither exclusively Irish nor exclusively Scandinavian, and they came up with a word to describe these people. They called them the Galgael, which means the foreigner Irish. These Galgael had a foot in both cultural worlds. They were often bilingual in Irish and Norse, and they could function comfortably in the whole northern world that encompassed Northern Ireland, Scotland, and Scandinavia. They were the ancestors of a very important group of mercenaries in the later Middle Ages who were brought into both Ireland and Scotland from the islands in the Irish Sea and western Scotland. They were known as the Galoglas, or foreign soldiers, which, if you know your Macbeth, is one of the kinds of soldiers that the fierce rebel MacDonald brought in to fight against King Duncan. But let's get back to the 10th century. As the Vikings increasingly converted to Christianity, the Irish kings felt more comfortable working with them and accepting them as clients. And we see the same openness to Viking interactions in the political realm as we do in the realms of art and commerce. Before long, the Viking settlements had effectively been slotted into the native Irish political hierarchy, where you see a few large dynasties competing for the allegiance of small client kingdoms. The Vikings were lucrative allies to recruit, not enemies to get rid of. Irish kings regarded the newcomers who had put down roots along their coastline as just one more element in a complicated local power struggle. And these kings decided how to react to the Vikings on a case-by-case basis. They fought against some groups of Vikings and allied with others in an effort to improve their own position vis-a-vis other Irish kings. The most important king to do so was Brian Boru, a southern Irish king who allied with Vikings to help defeat his Irish rivals. At the Great Battle of Clontarf in 1014, just north of the Viking city of Dublin, Brian and his Viking allies defeated another Irish king and his Viking allies. Ironically, this battle was later rebranded as a clash between the Irish and the Vikings, and a legend was born that stubbornly persists to this day, the notion that Brian Boru drove the Vikings out of Ireland. And in fact, this is what I learned as a very young student, from some rather unsophisticated books of Irish history for children. But the story was spun this way a century after the battle by Brian's descendants, the O'Briens, in order to make their family look more impressive. The real story, I think, is far more interesting. The Vikings and the Irish coexisting in a kind of fruitful interchange, surely not without tension, but not without advantages to both sides either. In order to understand what happened, we need to say a little bit about Irish politics in the 10th and early 11th centuries. Up until this time, Ireland had enjoyed a more or less stable system, and I do mean more or less stable, where both the northern half and the southern half of Ireland were each dominated by one major dynasty. This system began to break down in the early 10th century. One of the results of this upheaval was the rise of a new dynasty in Munster in the southwest that would end up replacing the dominant power there. This, of course, was Brian Boru. Brian is obviously one of the most famous figures in Irish history. He was called the Lion of Ireland, and there is a popular historical novel about him by the same title, which I quite enjoyed. Brian established his headquarters at Kincora in what is now County Clare. But Brian was not content merely with being a provincial king. He aspired to more, and you can see if you plot on a map his various campaigns during the course of his very long reign. He starts out basically confined to the south, but then he is increasingly able to move out of his own region and travel through the whole island of Ireland at will. It took tremendous energy to be on the move so constantly in an age when travel was difficult, but it was essential in an Irish ruler because you really had to show up in person if you wanted anyone to pay attention to what you said. How did he do it? Well, he must have had extraordinary energy. All successful medieval kings had to have this, but it was a necessary, not sufficient condition. You had to have more going for you than that. First, Brian was able to take advantage of divisions within the other Irish kingdoms. This was not a rare state of affairs, it must be said. Irish politics were complicated and fractious at the best of times. Second, Brian proved to be very adept at using the Norse settlements. He forged helpful alliances with the Norse of Limerick. Limerick was not far from Kincorrup, as well as with the Norse of Waterford and Cork, and even occasionally with Dublin. His Norse allies often held the balance of power in his favor. Third, he was very good at public relations. He knew that having the church on his side would be a big help, so he made a very large donation to St. Patrick's Church at Armagh. He installed many of his own family members at the head of important churches in Munster, and he thus had the major secular and religious powers in Ireland on his side. But Brian's success rested on a pretty shaky institutional foundation. Or rather, it had no institutional foundation at all. It depended largely on his own energy, and that inevitably began to fail. In the year 1012, cracks began to appear in Brian's dominance. The northern half of Ireland had never been as securely under his control as the south, and in that year, some northern leaders took the field against him. His ally, the King of Meath, who was still dominant in the east, fell out with the Dublin Norse, and by the following year, Brian was forced to blockade Dublin in support. The siege lasted over the winter. The Norse in Dublin knew that the attack would be renewed in the spring, so they called in their allies from the Isles, the islands around Britain, including the Orkneys and the Isle of Man. The men of Leinster, who had been chafing under Brian's overlordship for almost 2 decades, also got ready to move. Brian called on his supposed allies in the north and the west, but they failed to turn out. His support in those regions was indeed shallow. To make matters worse, right before the imminent battle, Brian quarreled with the King of Meath, so he was relatively isolated, except for a contingent of supporters from the Norse community in Limerick. Thus, he went into battle on Good Friday, April 23, 1014. The battle lasted all day. Eventually, Brian's side routed the Leinstermen and the Dublin Norse, but Brian, who was too old and infirm to fight himself, was killed in his tent by Norsemen who were retreating in panic. The King of Leinster was also killed, though the King of the Dublin Norse managed to preserve himself by staying out of the battle completely. After his death, Brian was taken north to Armagh and buried there with elaborate ceremonial, as befitted a High King of Ireland, and his resting place is still marked in Armagh Cathedral today. So why does this battle matter? By itself, it did not end the Viking presence in Ireland. The Norse communities persisted for centuries thereafter, and the end of active raiding around this time had much less to do with Clontarf than with the conversion of Scandinavians back home to Christianity. After about the year 1000, the Vikings mostly stopped going a Viking and stayed home. So it's not about the Irish versus the Vikings. In fact, the two sides have been coming together for a century or so, as we have seen. The end of the Viking story in Ireland is a bit less glorious. For 2 centuries after the Battle of Clontarf, the Norse settlements maintained their distinctive identity, and the city of Dublin in particular was very important politically. But the Dublin Norse were less and less able to maintain their independence, and more likely to fall under the overlordship of one or another of the Irish provincial kings. When the English invaded in the 1160s and 70s, they seized control of the Viking towns, and the Norse element there was swamped by the new English settlers. Still, the legacy of the Vikings in Ireland survives in the Irish cities, and, as science is now showing, in the Irish people. I have a friend whose ancestry is supposedly 100% from County Cork in southwest Ireland, but her genetic profile contains a significant percentage of Scandinavian ancestry. Many personal names that now seem to us quintessentially Irish are actually Scandinavian in origin, such as Doyle, which means son of the dark foreigner, or MacAuliffe, which means son of Olaf. So the Viking influence on Ireland needs to be uncovered, but it's certainly there. I want to turn now to Scotland, where the story was somewhat different. Here, the Norse maintained a separate identity for far longer than they did in Ireland. The Vikings settled more extensively in parts of western and northern mainland Scotland and in the islands around Scotland, both to the west and to the north, and there was no English conquest of Scotland to erase their cultural presence. Thus, Scotland was much more diverse, both ethnically and linguistically, than Ireland was. Scotland, of course, had always been diverse. You may remember that in the early Middle Ages, many languages were spoken there simultaneously, not all of which were Celtic. But now the Norse language was added to the mix. We have less information about the early years of Norse activity in Scotland because there are fewer records that survive, but settlement seems to have begun with the Northern Isles of Scotland, the Shetlands and Orkneys, at some point around the late 8th century. The indigenous inhabitants of these islands probably spoke Pictish at the time, but Scandinavian influences quickly prevailed. The Norse influence on Scotland was very long-lasting indeed. The northern islands of Scotland were culturally Norse rather than Gaelic. In fact, a local variant of the Norse language known as Norn was spoken in those islands down to the 18th century. The height of the Scandinavian advance probably occurred in the middle of the 11th century with the career of the formidable Thorfinn Sigurdsson, Earl of Orkney. Thorfinn was able to extend Scandinavian rule onto the mainland of Scotland in the far north, and that is still the part of the mainland with the highest concentration of Norse place names, such as Sutherland, Wick, and Dingwall. Thorfinn is an interesting character, and it would be nice to know much more about him. He is the subject of a saga in Old Norse, which is a good sign of how important Scotland was to the large Scandinavian cultural realm. Although many details of Thorfinn's life are uncertain, he was clearly a classic example of the kind of cultural hybridity that we find in this area. His father was a Scandinavian earl named Sigurd, who died at the Battle of Clontarf in 1014, but his mother was the daughter of a Scottish ruler, possibly King Malcolm II of Scotland, though other candidates have been proposed. This means he was undoubtedly bilingual in Norse and Gaelic. In fact, Thorfinn is such an ambivalent figure that some scholars have even proposed that Thorfinn is actually identical with the character we know of as Macbeth, and this is the premise of a brilliant historical novel by Dorothy Dunnett called King Hereafter. I am not persuaded, much as I love the novel, but the fact that this hypothesis could gain any traction at all is a good sign of how intermingled the Celtic-speaking and Norse-speaking worlds were at this period. And we'll talk more about the historical Macbeth in another lecture. Vikings also settled in western Isles of Scotland and the Isle of Man and created a multi-ethnic, multilingual Kingdom of the Isles, and the later Lords of the Isles, who were largely autonomous, were not finally subdued by the Scottish crown until the end of the 15th century. Many of the clans of the Western Isles, including Clan MacLeod, trace their ancestry back to Norse rulers. I want to talk about one final area in more detail, because I think it perfectly exemplifies the cultural fluidity of the Irish Sea region, and that is one specific component of the Kingdom of the Isles, namely the Isle of Man, which is right in the middle of the Irish Sea, about equidistant from Ireland, northern England, and southern Scotland. The origin of the name is a bit mysterious, but it could refer to a Celtic word for mountain, or it could also be a reference to the Celtic god of the sea, Manannán Maclear. The Isle of Man was really a melting pot where all of the diverse influences in what historians now like to call the Irish Sea world all came together. and it's easy to see why this should be so when you look at its location and also hear a brief rundown of the different regimes that have ruled the Isle of Man over the past millennium and a half. The earliest inhabitants of Man that we know of were probably Brittonic speakers, that is, they spoke the P-Celtic language of Britain. At some point in the 6th century, Man was probably occupied by people from the north of Ireland, and there may even have been a brief interlude in the 7th century when the English-speaking people of the Kingdom of Northumbria seized control of the island. Thereafter, though, the main contest was between Irish and Scandinavian influence. In the 10th and 11th centuries, the island was ruled first by the Viking kings of Dublin and then by the Viking earls of Orkney. So first Irish Vikings and then Scottish Vikings, if you will. But the population was primarily Gaelic in culture and language. During this period, the language of Man became more distinct from Irish until it developed into the Goidelic or Q-Celtic language we know today as Manx. A watershed moment for the Isle of Man came in 1079 when the Crovan dynasty established itself on the island. Although the Crovan kings were nominally subject to the kings of Norway, it was not until the 13th century that the Norse kings were powerful enough to try to assert their dominance. And by that point, the increasingly powerful Kingdom of Scotland was interested in cracking down on Norse influence on its western periphery. In the 1260s, Scotland and Norway fought a war partly over control of Man, and Scotland emerged victorious. However, the victory was short-lived. The English and the Scots traded control of Man over the next century or so, and the Scottish king David II, who was captured by the English in 1346 at the Battle of Neville's Cross, was actually forced to bargain away the Isle of Man when he couldn't pay his ransom. With a few hiccups along the way, England has ruled Man ever since, but it has a strange constitutional position. Man is not subject to the British Parliament. It is autonomous within the United Kingdom, and it coins its own money and prints its own postage stamps. In fact, it makes a lot of money on stamp collectors. The Manx language, alas, is largely extinct, though there are efforts underway to revive it. Of course, we can't leave this discussion without touching on a topic that probably most people think of first when they think of the Isle of Man, and that is the famous Manx cat. Manx cats have no real tails. The taillessness is caused by a genetic mutation that seems to have arisen independently on the Isle of Man. There are all sorts of legends about the cats, including one in which the cats arrived on a ship of the Spanish Armada that was wrecked and the cats swam ashore. Not very likely. But interestingly, sort of like there is with the Irish Book of Invasion, there is a grain of truth to the Spanish connection with the Manx cats, in that the cats of the Isle of Man turn out to be descended from the Spanish wildcat, rather than the common European wildcat, which is where the other cats of Britain and Ireland come from. So maybe the first cats came with the sons of Meal. We end with the Isle of Man because it is right at the center of the Irish Sea world, and because it perfectly encapsulates the kind of interplay of cultures that makes this region so fascinating. The Celtic-speaking peoples were always open to outside influences, and for many years they existed in close contact with Scandinavian peoples. Some of these encounters were violent, but many were fruitful, and they have left a lasting legacy in the landscape and people of this fascinating region. Thank you for walking these ancient paths with us tonight. If you're still awake, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video so we can keep creating quiet stories for curious minds. Rest well, and remember there's always more. History waiting just beyond the horizon. This has been the Sleepless Historian. Good night.